I will put, oh, forgot to do that. Thank you, co-host extraordinaire, whichever one of you is that. We are recording the webinar today. It'll be sent out 2 days after the webinar to folks. So if you have to leave early, you're going to miss some really great, juicy stuff in the EV space that we are talking about. Back to my Seawheel plug. I'm going to copy a link, put it in the chat if you're interested in supporting their match. They get up to a $20,000 match and they're more than halfway there. So anything helps. I also wanted to plug, please stay tuned for the Association of Energy Engineers New England annual Energy Outlook. That is a can't miss event and it sells out every year. It's coming in January. Seawheel also has a January breakfast meeting on January 26th at National Grid Sustainability Hub in Worcester. It's going to be an elevator pitch workshop and breakfast, which is really exciting.
So the other thing is 2019. So.
Oh. Can I get help? Okay, thank you. And also, Energy Matters to You is a podcast that is sponsored by AEE New England. And our most recent episode is on net zero with David McDougall of McDougall Energy Advisors. And there will be an episode forthcoming shortly with Brett Feldman of Rhode Island Energy to discuss the latest program updates. Awesome. So that is housekeeping. Thank you again. Thanks for joining, those of you who are logging on now. My name is Nicole Vudrin. I am an energy and EV industry consultant. I've been in the energy efficiency and EV adjacent space my entire career. I was a board member of AEE New England, and I'm now a board member of Seawheel. And I had the pleasure of sharing a table with both Michelle and Anna at an event last month when I had been asked to, kind of put together for AEE an event on the EV industry and EV charging. And we had such great conversation at that event that I asked them both to, co-host this with me and just have an EV fireside chat, kind of replicating a model that they had at that event where a moderator kind of steered the direction of the conversation and just had a discussion. We're, I think, all kind of slide deck fatigued at this point. At least I am. So Anna is the electric vehicle program director at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. It's a Massachusetts and Rhode Island based nonprofit working to speed the transition to a zero carbon future. And Michelle is a co-founder of Voltrek, which is a turnkey EV charging solution company founded in 2010. Really, forward thinking back in 2010 to start something in the space. I'm starting something in this space now, but I'm way behind the times. So Michelle's been a forerunner in the EV industry. She is currently working in the public sector because her passion really is policy. She worked for Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, where she designed the Clean Vehicle Program and the More EV program, which is an incentive for purchasing both new and used electric vehicles. And she currently works for the Operational Services Division. So, talked a lot. Anna, Michelle, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much.
Our pleasure.
Anna, do you want to start and kind of give just some information about the work that you do and that Green Energy Consumers Alliance does in the EV space? Like, what are your favorite things that you work on there that you want to talk about?
Sure. So Green Energy Consumers, as you mentioned, is an organization that's trying to speed the transition to a zero carbon future. And we always do that in two ways, basically. So on the one hand, we run consumer facing programs that people can tap into. And on the other, we do public policy advocacy work. So in the transportation world, we run a program called Drive Green, which we launched in 2016 when there were like 3 to 4 actual EV models available that weren't Teslas. And what that program does is really a lot of consumer education. We do a lot of webinars and ride and drive events and blog posts and social media because there's still so many misconceptions about electric cars. And we also work with a network of dealers who post deals on our website. So you can go to our shopping tool, learn about the different vehicles, and then sign up to test drive or pre-order or get a car with a local dealer. And our goal from the get-go has really been to smooth out the process, because already buying a car is a challenging prospect that is not enjoyable. And then if you throw in a whole new technology, that's enough to turn people away. So we really want to be there as sort of a handholder, a guide, or a trusted third party to be like, you can do this. We can answer your questions. Let's go. And then we take the experience that we learned talking to real people and also car dealers and also charging installers to inform the advocacy work that we do at the state level. So kind of coming at the issue from lots of different angles.
Yeah, one of my favorite things that you all do is your ride and drive event where you get EVs from a bunch of different manufacturers, and you can sign up and do test drives and, you know, just sit in and touch all the bells and whistles and talk to folks about what sets that EV apart. That's really great. I got to drive a Polestar, which is not anywhere in my affordability, but you know, it was still cool to give it a go. Michelle, how about you? What are some of your pet projects, your favorite things that you get to work on day to day or that you have worked on in the past in this space?
Well, it's an interesting time to ask me, and I appreciate it, because this summer is when I switched over from energy and the Department of Energy Resources over to Operational Services Division, OSD. And I'd been at DOER for about 9 years, and they're very environmental program oriented over there. It's an advisory agency. So we were able to run grant programs and rebate programs, that kind of thing. With the Healy administration's new climate change initiatives, they decided that OSD also needed a climate division. And OSD, if you don't know, takes care of statewide contracts, vendors on statewide contract. So they had environmentally preferred products involved, and they do have some contracts for EVSE and for electric vehicles, but there's no big climate push, and there's nothing that ties everything together at OSD at this point. So they brought in myself and a data specialist, and we are the climate division right now at OSD. So we've really been trying to get things up and running, seeing where there are holes, where people are going in the right direction. And I'm just going to put one little plug out there. We are looking to reopen a statewide contract, and we will be looking for vendors in the consulting space. We would really like to have some people in the grant writing consulting space, people who can help identify grants and write for them, especially for municipalities, because you have to think that so many of these organizations, municipalities, small businesses, etc., don't really have the expertise. They need the grants, but not everyone has a grant writer. Almost nobody has a grant writer, right? So if I don't find you, please feel free to contact me so that I can tell you how to get on the list to be notified when the contract has been reopened. So that's my little plug for how I can help you help me. That's
awesome. I can tell by looking at our participants list, there's lots of consultants in the crowd or companies that provide consulting. So hopefully they'll have some grant writing support.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great. That's great. So that's it. That's it for me so far. Thanks.
Awesome. So one thing I wanted to talk about, you know, there's lots of wonderful policy in place in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and in New England to support the adoption of electric vehicles and electric micro mobility. You know, for instance, I just got an electric leaf blower and I got an incentive from Eversource for that. But what are some barriers that you're both seeing that are barriers to adoption of electric vehicles? I mean, we all read the headlines. I could probably spout a couple. But what do you two think are, some of the biggest ones that policy could support?
I'm happy to jump in because these are the barriers that we're
Right.
trying to tackle day to day. So one is the upfront cost. Electric vehicles still come at a cost premium because of the cost of manufacturing the battery. Over the life of the vehicle, the operating costs are definitely lower because you've got fuel savings and maintenance savings with the electric cars, but that upfront cost is still a barrier to lots of people. The second big barrier is access to charging. If you have your own home and you have an outlet near where you park and you park off street, it's really easy to charge. If you are not lucky enough to live in that situation, it's definitely a challenge. And then the third barrier is really education. There's just people don't know about the different vehicles. They don't know about the different incentives. They don't know to ask anybody about the incentives from the utilities or the state or the federal government. So there's just a lot of public education that still needs to be done. So we happy to go into detail on any of those, but those are sort of our top three.
What's your take on those, Michelle?
I absolutely, Anna's completely correct, especially on the big ones. There are some other details that play into those, right? So when we're talking about purchase price, we also have limited selection with supply chain issues. We're talking about charging infrastructure. We still have severe range anxiety. We have charging price structures. We have the financing and ownership models of EVSE. And then it can get to larger things like grid capacity, but smaller things even like finding a technician who's going to service your EV. So we face what we can call maybe a handful of big issues, but then they all come with other strings attached. So that's really why we need so many different types of people and different types of organizations to get involved and be involved in this space because of the intricacies, because of the unintended consequences, right? The things we don't foresee, who's going to jump right on those? And who's going to foresee the next big issues? You never know.
Right.
So if
Absolutely.
yeah.
Like the early adopters have adopted, and now you have kind of the regular populace that are on the fence for any of these reasons or than others. So one, I guess, barrier removal to the upfront cost of EVs, there is kind of a price war happening between various EV manufacturers. And there's also tax credits and there's, our state programs. Anna, can you speak to those at all? To Michelle's
love
point,
nothing
there's
more.
okay. I'm sure you do that in 10 Zoom meetings a day.
I do. So the last year has been really fascinating to watch because there has been a price war or just plain old good old competition between manufacturers. And that is driven partially, not entirely, but partially by policy, which is great because it means we have tools at our disposal that we can use. So the federal tax credit that has existed for a long time was changed pretty significantly with the Inflation Reduction Act. And one of the key pieces of that was that for the first time, there was an MSRP cap. So only vehicles that were under a certain limit would qualify for the federal tax credit. And that was a poke at the manufacturers to really reduce their prices because if they're above that, the vehicles don't qualify. I'm happy to go into the actual details of the federal tax credit and the state rebate, but at a high level, the federal tax credit is up to $7,500. I say up to because it depends on the vehicle. There's lots of different requirements now, but there is a list where you can just go and see this vehicle qualifies for this. That list will change every year because every year there are battery and mineral requirements that ramp up. So on January 1st, the requirements will change. So we don't know what vehicles will qualify in January right now, but we do know what qualifies through the end of December. And that is a tax credit. So this year it means that you can only take advantage of the full tax credit if you have a high enough tax liability. Next year, you should be able to take advantage of the tax credit at the point of sale. And at that point, your personal tax liability won't be a limiting factor anymore. So that's very exciting. In Massachusetts, we've got a state rebate that Michelle can tell us all about, but it's basically $3,500 for a new or used vehicle. If you're going used, you have to fulfill some income requirements to qualify. And if you are low income, there's a higher incentive. It's $5,000 instead of $3,500. But you can get that incentive either by applying for it after you've purchased or leased a vehicle, or by going to one of a list of participating dealers where you can get the rebate at the point of sale. So what's very exciting is next year, presumably, there will be a point where you can go to a dealership and get the federal tax credit and the state rebate right at the point of purchase. So you don't have to fill out any paperwork after the fact. You don't have to shell out thousands of dollars and then wait to be reimbursed. And that will hopefully open up this technology to a lot more people who just couldn't access it before.
Yeah, absolutely. I was worried we might be off-putting some people when we're supposed to be advocating for EV adoption and net zero. We're talking about all these awful barriers, but the great news is that, you know, there's the barriers being removed through policy and advocacy. So access to charging, that's another big one. And you also mentioned education, of course. And hold on, someone needs to get muted. Okay, I think we're good. What I foresee is a need for behavior change and education related to that behavior change. You know, right now we're used to something called depot fueling, where we go to a central location, we fuel our gas tanks in a matter of minutes, and we continue on. But if you have access to charging where you park your car overnight, or where it's dwelling the longest, you're going to start each day with a full tank. So you're going to kind of do, folks are going to need to kind of do what they do with their cell phones, right? What's your take on that, Michelle? You know, access to charging and behavior change.
Sorry, my mute button. This is definitely a big deal, access to charging. And most people we know are going to charge at home overnight. What's that, 80 or 90%? Anna might have more specific numbers now on how many people are going to be overnight charging in a residence. But again, we're looking at some low-hanging fruit here, because these are people that have single family dwellings. They have either garages or a driveway with an outside wall that they could put a charger on. And then we get into areas where charging access is really tough to deal with, like multi-unit dwellings, where you have who's going to own the station, who's going to put it in, who's going to pay for the electricity, is it going to be a designated spot? There are really many more barriers to charging in urban settings with a lot of multi-unit dwellings, and also conversely in rural settings where it doesn't make a lot of sense to put in charging yet, because there aren't a lot of EVs, because there isn't a lot of charging yet. So we get back to our chicken and egg thing, especially in rural areas. And that, I think, is something that's going to be changing, not just through grant programs, but by vehicles like the Rivian and the Silverado that's coming out with over 400 miles of range. I think that that's going to be potentially one of the game changers in rural areas. And with that will have to come charging infrastructure. Like, end of story on that one.
I'll put in a plug here for the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. So the conundrum of how to provide charging access to people who live in apartments and condos is like clearly identified as a nut we need to crack. And the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center will be hopefully releasing a request for proposals in January, specifically targeting a couple parts of the transportation sector. But one of the topics they've identified is being of interest to them is how to crack this nut of getting access to charging in multi-unit dwellings. So if you have ideas about that, go talk to the Mass CEC Clean Transportation team, because they are all ears until they release this RFP.
And if you have a full-on solution, talk to us because you'll make us heroes.
Oh yeah. Happy to work with you, especially if you provide a solution already.
Yeah, there's definitely lots of startups in the multi-unit dwelling space that they're trying to solve that. I think Orange Charger, they're a level 1 charger, because you're going to be dwelling a long time. You don't necessarily need that high power, high kW flow rate. So I think also talking about education and behavior change, I was having a conversation with somebody over Thanksgiving where they said, well, until I can have a DC fast charger in my home, I don't want an EV. And then I started having conversation with them about, well, how long do you park your vehicle and how far do you drive it? And, kind of, providing that one-on-one education that EV advocates can provide. And they were like, oh, so I could just plug into a wall overnight and have almost a full charge in the morning, depending upon the size of the battery, etc. So it brings me to, there's the charging pyramid where you have level 1 charging, which is, plugging into a standard outlet. You have level 2, which I don't have the range in front of me, but, it's faster, but not very fast. And then you have DC fast charging. And what do you think the mix is going to need to be? I know it's, kind of asking for a crystal ball, or at least what in your experience is an effective mix of publicly available DC fast chargers to level 2 chargers. Is there like a dream ratio or something like that?
I don't know of a dream ratio per se, but I think part of what's going to have to happen here is a full-on mindset change. Now, I don't know who all these people are that think they're going to pack up and drive across the country, so they're super concerned about that right now. But as Nicole pointed out, and as Anna referenced as well, people need to think about what's practical, and sometimes they don't realize how practical an EV can be for them. So there's that sort of mindset shift. And then there's the whole refueling mindset shift that has to take place, where we're not going to just have that gas station model where you're fueling up in between your destinations. We're going to start thinking about it like, I'm going to refuel at my destination. I'm going to go to the movies. I'm going to go out to dinner. I'm going to go to the mall. So most of what we do in any given day can be covered by a combination of home charging and either workplace charging or public level 2. We definitely need the fast chargers, and that's going to contribute as well to helping us with multi-unit dwellings and that kind of thing. But that's not the be all end all. I don't see this as necessarily going to a full-on gas station model where we're just looking at level 3s and we're just looking at 10 minutes, go to the bathroom, grab a soda, you're all done, literally. I think it's going to take some time, a little bit more time. And I don't know that level 1 and level 2 are going to just be run out of existence by the fast charging. I think there's a lot to be said for taking care of your battery. There are some battery degradation issues, not as many as people fear, but there's a little bit of that. And I think that we're not going to be seeing, I think it's safe to invest and plan for these level 2 public charging areas and level 1 where it's maybe appropriate at the airport, where you're parking for a week, that kind of thing, parking for a long weekend. You're all set with level 1 even. So that would be my take on that. Anna probably wants to add.
I have 2 things to add, if that's okay.
Go ahead, and then I'm going to kind of change.
So one is that we know this from anecdotal experience with all the EV owners that we talk to or who've gotten vehicles through our program. And also there have been some studies on this. Before people get a car, their top concern is, how am I going to charge after they get a car? They're like, what? That's not a what? That's so easy. Again, we have to acknowledge that that's because the early adopters are the ones for whom it's easiest to adopt. So they're the ones who can charge at home. But a lot of people come into this because we come in from a world with depot charging or depot fueling, as you said, assuming that's the paradigm. And you can tell people all you want, no, 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 it's different. But until you experience that, that concern really isn't gone. So that is one of the reasons why we rely so heavily on EV ambassadors, which are just normal people who own cars who are happy to chat about them, because there's just no way to communicate that shift unless you're a normal person. Like you can listen to a car dealer tell you that and kind of roll your eyes and be like, sure. But if your neighbor tells you that, it's a little bit different. The second thing I wanted to say is that there are so many analysts and consultants out there trying to find the magic ratio of chargers to cars. And it keeps changing all the time because car batteries are getting more efficient, but they're also getting bigger and the cars are also getting bigger. So that's always sort of in flux. But in Massachusetts, we have an electric vehicle infrastructure coordinating council, which is made up of representatives from a lot of different state agencies. And they, in their initial report, did some math basically, and they found that by 2030, we need 10,000 public DC fast charging stations. And by station, sorry, I mean ports. And we need 35,000 public level 2 charging ports and 700,000 workplace and residential charging ports. So you can see that the number of residential at workplace dwarfs everything else. But 10,000 DC fast chargers and 35,000 public level 2 is still a lot.
Right, because we're not even 10% of the way to literally any of those, and we have 7 years to go, right?
Yep.
Right.
Something along those lines. Yeah.
And just
So
to follow up on Anna's earlier point too, there are some very creative charging models that are coming out, and one's like an Airbnb for charging. So if you have a station at your home and you're willing to let other people come and charge up, that's fantastic. So just some creative ideas out there.
that's really interesting because Amp Up, which is a EV charging network software that I actually worked there. Hello, if I have any Amp Up friends in the audience. They started as an Airbnb of charging, and then now they've become, more full service network. So it's really interesting to see that they have matured and then it's come back to the Airbnb of charging. So the next thing I wanted to bring up in the charging picture is we have now this new charging standard called the North American Charging Standard, or NACS, that has been adopted by the majority of vehicle OEMs. And I want to, kind of know what are your thoughts on how that's going to affect adoption? Because I, in my opinion, see the OEMs making that announcement in July through October. A bunch of different vehicle manufacturers have made those announcements, and now they're kind of decrying that EV adoption is slowing. And I don't know if they see that in my opinion, the two are connected. What's your take on that?
That's interesting. I don't see them as being connected, actually. I mean, and I'm curious to hear what you think. From our perspective, it makes our lives on the education front. In the short term, it makes it harder because we have to explain what's going on. But in the long term, it's so much easier because we used to have to sit here and go, well, there's the CCS combo standard, which is also known as the SAE. And then there's CHAdeMO, and it depends on what car. And it's just a headache because people are like, I just want to know that the plug works. So on that front, I think it'll be easier. I think it'll be easier for car dealers to sell the vehicles because they don't have to explain, and this one has this type of plug, and you need to make sure to press this filter on these apps and all that. But I do think it's going to be a bumpy ride for the next year to see, hopefully when they roll out all the adapters, that they all work and that all the stations can talk to each other, because it's not just the hardware, it's the software that has to communicate back and forth. So we'll see, but I don't want to talk too much, so I'll let you talk.
Well, I'll just answer briefly why I think they're somewhat connected. Myself personally, I'm in the market. I do, full disclosure, do not drive an EV yet. I have 3 ICE vehicles in my driveway. Well, one's in the garage, but I digress. And it hasn't made fiscal sense for our family yet. I am making the jump as soon as possible. It's hard. It feels very hypocritical to be in this space and not own an EV and have that firsthand experience. But I do, sorry, I'm getting a pop-up. I do rent EVs, and I rent EVs of different manufacturers so that way I can have that firsthand charging experience. Where was I going with this? So I was looking at purchasing an electric vehicle, and then Hyundai has announced that they're adopting the NACS standard. Well, I want to adopt one that has the NACS port native on the vehicle. And that's not going to happen till late 24, early 25. And I want a vehicle now, but I'm going to postpone that purchase until I have native NACS adoption on my vehicle, because I don't want to futz with adapters. Who knows if they're UL listed? Who's going to provide them? The dealership, or do I have to purchase it? Or, there's just so many more decision points as a not early adopter, but EV advocate. So that's where I see that it's somewhat related. Meanwhile, they're decrying that EV adoption stalling, yet September, October have had record EV adoption. So someone is saying in the chat it's a false narrative. I absolutely agree. I also think they maybe are not making the vehicles electric that speak to this next round of adoption in our adoption curve. I love smaller hatchbacks that are very efficient. I don't need an F-150 Lightning. I'm not a fleet. I'm not a construction, I don't own a construction company. So that's where I'm seeing it's related. Michelle, what's your take?
I can definitely see that, but as a short-term issue. I do think there's a bit of a false narrative about sales falling off when you consider that we just had supply chain issues for years, and we're just coming out of that. Like, let's take a breath. Let's not panic. Let's let everyone start buying cars again, for reasonable prices, and see how that goes. So I can definitely see the short term. I'm gonna put it off. If this is being opened up and it's just waiting till 2025, but that's problematic because car purchases aren't typically made every couple of years. You can switch up a lease. I mean, it's a good reason to lease, right? And switch up in 3 years. But I could see it putting a short-term dampening on purchasing. Long-term, it's still a question. I mean, this has been a year in the making. It's not like an overnight deal, and there are some issues with it, the good faith clause being one of them that was slowing down why OEMs might not want to take Tesla up on their offer, because the wording is such that it is not proprietary anymore. 2 OEMs that act in good faith are using it in good faith, and that opens up patents on both sides. So by good faith, they mean that you cannot sue Tesla for then going after your patents as well. And that could be a sticking point. It was a sticking point. It has been a sticking point. But now, as you pointed out, Nicole, the big OEMs are coming on board. And I mean, this is a serious opening up of charging. Even if your car doesn't have the NACS connector yet, there are adapters available. So it's not like a stop. It's not a hard stop on these purchases and what's going to happen. It's absolutely a convenience issue, moving forward. But if we can really open up this network better than, say, Electrify America, which has had trouble since Jump, I feel like that is going to just free people's minds a little bit from the range anxiety. And that's one of the biggest obstacles we've already identified. So So
Right,
I think there's
absolutely.
going to be both.
Yeah, well, and to take a step back and give some background too, the adoption of NACS as a charging standard also opens up Tesla chargers to non-Tesla vehicles where, you know, they are far and away the largest DC fast charging network in the United States because they were, you know, they're the first, they were very forward thinking. And in my experience, when I rented a Tesla, the charging experience is unparalleled across other vehicles because, to someone's point in the what is it called, the chat, you plug and charge, you plug in, you charge it. You don't need to download an app and hope that you have cellular connectivity or Wi-Fi in the bowels of the parking garage. You know, it's just, you plug the vehicle in, it recognizes the vehicle, does a handshake, and it provides the charge. So there is a standard ISO 15118, which is the plug and charge standard. And yes, hopefully that will be part of the NACS adoption. But every vehicle manufacturer that's non-Tesla has to, you know, work through all of that software and communication in the background. And that's why that, you know, they're going to adopt it future date. Because it takes a bit to accommodate for that. And that will absolutely help. You know, I read all these, you know, charging nightmares on LinkedIn, and most of them have to do, you know, the Electrify America stations were queued up and, you know, I had to wait a long time, or they weren't working at their full power, etc. So hopefully we'll not have as much congestion, but there'll still be congestion at peak times for charging.
I'll say that the piece about getting the charging software to talk to the car software is not a new problem. Like, anytime manufacturers over the past couple of years have rolled out new cars, there's always hiccups with somebody using that vehicle charging at a new charging station. That is just sort of, I think, the growing pains of this industry, which unfortunately those of us who are working on it now get to witness, so that hopefully 5 years down the line, this is ancient history that these problems exist. But the one other thing I wanted to point out is that this whole NACS thing is largely coming as a result of policy, again, because with the bipartisan infrastructure law, those funds are only available for DC fast chargers that more than one make can use. And so that really lit a fire under Tesla's butt, frankly, that if they wanted to be able to tap into all of that federal money to build out DC fast charging stations across the country, they couldn't maintain a Tesla only charging port. And so that is another example of, you know, policy having an impact that will hopefully make all of this easier for all of us. And I saw in the chat also somebody mentioned that a bunch of the manufacturers are going to spend a whole lot of money building out DC fast charging stations at the same time as the federal government is, which is great because we need, you know, thousands of them ASAP. So hopefully all of that comes together in a good way.
Sorry, my dog's going crazy in the background. Take it away, Michelle.
Sorry, it's just I ejected my dog for that very reason, but he may come home anytime, so we'll see. We'll see about that. Yeah, I think that it's very interesting, the regulatory aspect of this, because Tesla was not eligible, right? So they're going to have a huge freak out, understandably, and hopefully get themselves in line. Now they've taken, you know, they're trying to be forthcoming, and they're trying to expand the network, and they will, and I think that's fabulous. I just think we need to kind of keep a close eye on the business practices, and I guess that would be my only cautionary tale about it.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll definitely stay tuned. It should be interesting as the vehicles start to adopt and are able to accept charging at Tesla stations. So there was a message in the chat that I think is really valuable for us to discuss: the value of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. as a transition vehicle. And in my opinion, which you're all welcome to disagree with, I think they're the worst of both worlds, but I would love to hear your thoughts before I chime in.
I think that they have been a nice transition, but cars last a long time. We're not buying a pair of shoes. So once a plug-in hybrid is made, it's on the road for what, 10 to 15 years, right? So I think we need to think a little bit more long term. If we're here to really adopt electric, we need to really push electric, because there's no way, if you have a plug-in hybrid, first of all, you could be getting 60 or 80 miles, but you could be getting like 15, right? The tiny Prius batteries that we've come up with, where you're driving for like 16 miles on electric and you're definitely going to gas. And are you contributing to greenhouse gas emissions? Yes, you are. Every time you run on electricity. Are you contributing to greenhouse gas emissions? Yes, you are. Every time you use gas. And there's just no way to tell. So, I mean, as far as record keeping goes, it's a nightmare, because how are you measuring any of this stuff, right? When you have no idea. You can make assumptions, but that's really all you can make, are assumptions about how well these cars are helping us out. So I would espouse pushing fully electric with the rebate programs and with the subsidies and that kind of thing. That's where my mind's at.
I think I echo a lot of that. I think that the plug-in hybrids were a transition a couple years ago. Like the Chevy Volt got 53 miles per charge in the latest iteration, and that was enough for a lot of people to dip their toe in at a time when the only other options were really, really pricey Teslas. That was before the Bolt. The Leaf got like less than 100 miles per charge, and that was a way for people to dip their toe in. And a lot of people were like, I can do 80% of my driving on electricity, and it's great. And that sort of moved us forward. I do think that one of the huge benefits of electric cars is that they are so much simpler. There's just fewer moving parts. The maintenance costs are way lower. The fuel costs are way lower. They're much more efficient. And when you've got a plug-in hybrid, you lose a lot of that, because now you've got the EV plus the traditional internal combustion engine, plus the complication of how are those two systems going to talk to each other. And I think the vehicles that we see available in Massachusetts is influenced by state policy, federal policy, but also the global car market. And the global car market is going all electric in China, in India, in Europe. That's the direction the manufacturers are going, partially because of policies, partially because it's just simpler to produce those vehicles. So I think that's the way we're going to go. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that one of the big state policies that we have is the Advanced Clean Cars 2 standards, which Massachusetts adopted based out of what California had put out. And those require that manufacturers sell an increasing percentage of electric vehicles every year from model year 2026 to model year 2035. And plug-in hybrids count, but only to a limited degree and only for a couple of years. So I think that policy will also keep pushing this transition that I think is already happening because of economics and sort of global forces.
So you both covered some of the reasons why I think they're worst of both worlds. I mean, you also pay a premium for them over a traditional ICE vehicle or a standard hybrid. And then you have both the electric vehicle battery to worry about and your gas tank. You also need oil changes and that, traditional ICE vehicle maintenance needs. And I think, studies have found that some folks just don't charge the EV portion and rely on the gas, because that's kind of the way it's always been done. So I agree. I think some people they're really great, but I'm going all electric when I choose my next vehicle.
It's kind of like playing EV.
Yeah, role playing in an EV RPG. what is the role of dealerships in EV adoption, and how are they hindering adoption or helping adoption, and what can they do differently to support adoption further?
I'm sure we have dealers and whatnot on the call, so I'm going to be gentle, but they have traditionally been one of our larger barriers. First of all, most of them can't even get the cars on their lots, or don't try to always get the cars on the lots. Even when they can, so sometimes there's like an EV salesperson, but it's not typical that every salesperson is versed on EVs. And people have come to us and said, I was literally talked out of it by the dealer. So I think that's changing. I think that the Dealership Association has been trying to address this. I know they're meeting with government agencies frequently. I know we met with them at DOER several times and did some meetings with them. And so from the top down, they're pushing this. There's a dealership effort. But I think that education is this is one big place where outreach and education only benefits us. It's not just to the public consumers, it's to dealerships as well. None of us started knowing about EVs, right? But we all know something about gas vehicles. I know very little, I'm going to admit that, but we all know something, right? So I see progress being made. Progress needs to continue to be made, and I think that there's going to be a push and pull with that as well.
Yeah, I think margins on ICE vehicles, also apologize, ICE is internal combustion engine. It's a traditional petroleum fuel based vehicle. I think, the margins are better, so they have more incentive to push we're talking traditional vehicle manufacturers here, like your big four, your Ford, GM, etc. Clearly your all electric companies like Tesla, they have entirely different business models, direct to consumer. I lost my thread of thought, but Anna, tag you in.
I would love to talk about this because we've been working with dealers since 2016 and have been simultaneously celebrating them and bashing our head against a wall during that whole time. So a couple things. One, there is a huge amount of variation between dealers and within dealers on enthusiasm and knowledge on EVs. We have some EV specialists at dealers that we call when we have questions because they know everything. They are reading about this in their spare time because they want to position their dealership as the leading force on this. And we have others where they're just giving flat out and wrong information about incentives, about batteries, about winter. So like there's a wide range. One thing that is really clear to me is that the business model of the non-direct sale, so the traditional automakers, first of all, is wild to me that we still live in a world like that business model still exists where you see one price online and then you walk into a store and you effectively have to haggle and like guess if you're being lied to. Like no other product do we buy like that at this point, but that one is so entrenched still. It's fascinating. But the business model is based on pushing a lot of volume quickly. The manufacturers learned during the pandemic and the supply chain issues that if they constrain supply a little bit, they can charge higher prices. So that's part of the reason why we keep seeing those higher prices. But if you are a salesperson in a dealership, you are trying to sell a lot of cars very fast. So you've got two strikes against EVs. One is that the margin is lower, and two is the opportunity cost. Because if you spend an hour talking to someone and being a great salesperson and explaining how charging works and that, oh, this is your electric utility, and so you have these incentives, and do you know the state rebate has different requirements than the federal tax credit, all of that, you might not make the sale in the first place, but even if you do, in that time, you could have sold 3 gas SUVs. So the business model itself is kind of working against us here. The other thing that we've seen a lot is turnover. It is, I I'm sure some people out there really enjoy being a salesperson, but it is a hard job where you have to be on all the time. You have to meet quotas every month. It is stressful. And so we see a lot of turnover. So we can invest a lot of time as a nonprofit working with this one person, trying to make sure they know everything. And then after a couple of months, it's a new salesperson. We have to start all over again. The last thing I'll say on this topic, I think, is that COVID has really changed things, and the car market is still trying to sort of figure out what it's doing. But what we saw a lot of during the sort of the beginning of the supply chain crunch is that a lot of the traditional manufacturers shifted to a place where you could order and pay for a vehicle online the same way that you would kind of with Tesla, but then choose a dealership to pick it up from. So they're trying to sort of be both a traditional automaker with franchise dealers and a sort of direct sale online platform. Hyundai just came out with that they're going to be selling cars through Amazon. So like there's a lot of change happening in this space that it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, definitely. I think also, when a lot of you have a better margin on ICE vehicles, but then also the finance deals is where a lot of their money's being made, and service packages, which EVs don't need the same level of service as ICE vehicles. So it's kind of a lose-lose for them, but it's a win-win, hopefully, for consumers. All right.
I will say that a higher percentage of the repairs that are needed on EVs happen at the dealer versus independent repair shops, which we can have a whole conversation about upskilling independent repair shops. But for dealers, at least, I think sometimes they hold on to the narrative of these cars need fewer repairs because it suits them. But a lot more of the repairs that are needed, if they are needed, happen at the dealership.
Yeah, because they see a higher volume of vehicles. They're more likely to have upskilled technicians, etc. So we're nearing the end of our hour. We got about 7 minutes left, but I wanted to ask both of you to get out your crystal balls and summon your inner soothsayers or visionaries. What's the biggest thing in this space that you see forthcoming in 2024? What is a policy coming through, or adoption threshold? What's your take on what the EV industry has in store for us in this space in the coming year?
I think that, and anyone could say this, so I'm not taking credit for this idea. As prices come down and range increases, we're going to see, I think, leaps and bounds. I think it's been slow till now. As you mentioned, Voltrek was not cutting edge, it was bleeding edge. We were, one of the first to market, which has its upsides and its downsides. It was very exciting, but I think we're going to start to see it grow more quickly as these cars and trucks are coming out. And I think that, as I said, those longer range pickup trucks I think that's going to do a lot for rural areas.
I'm going to cheat and answer with two answers. One is that I think momentum is really picking up again because of international forces. We could spend a whole hour talking about 3-wheeled and 2-wheeled electric vehicles in markets like India, where that's just exploding and having a huge impact on people's ability to get around, but also desire for cars in the first place and all that. And then the fact that here within the United States, we've got the double whammy basically of the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. We're seeing lots of new factories getting announced. Those are going to start actually getting built or producing, which is really exciting. On a more or less positive note, or like an unclear note, there is a part of the Inflation Reduction Act that kicks in 2024. So every year there are battery and mineral requirements that go up, and those are predictable. Like we know that it's going to go from 40 to 50%. That's great. In 2024, an additional thing kicks in, which is the foreign entity of concern piece, which is that if any I can't remember if it's mineral. I think it's if any battery component in a vehicle comes from a foreign entity of concern, it no longer qualifies for the federal tax credit, even if it meets all of the other requirements. And those foreign entities of concern are North Korea, Iran, China, and one other country. But China is where a lot of battery manufacturing takes place. So that I honestly don't know how many vehicles are going to qualify for the federal tax credit come January, because of that foreign entity of concern piece. And so that's going to be really interesting. We're getting into like international economic policy here, but that is one thing that we need to figure out how that's going to play out, because that's going to have a big impact.
Anna, will we still have the commercial loophole in 2024? And some background there. Residential vehicle purchases have to follow all of the very strict rules, or I guess traditional consumer purchases of electric vehicles to be eligible for the credit. But there is a commercial purchase loophole, which is how vehicles like the Hyundai Ioniq 5, for instance, Hyundai and Kia, do not meet the consumer standards, but they offer a lease and will pass through the credit savings through a lease. And also, if you're a commercial entity, so, fleets or, my commercial business purchases that vehicle, it can be eligible for the tax credit through the loophole.
Yeah, so that will continue to be the case. The foreign entity of concern is for the the personal vehicles.
Excellent. Yeah, I think, in my crystal ball, I see EV adoption continuing to break records month over month, year over year. It's really interesting because, you have Toyota, who's kind of like slow cooked the whole thing, saying they'd rather put the components into hybrid vehicles because you can reduce carbon footprint across a larger swath of people, as opposed to having a single EV battery. But then they have the solid state EV battery with allegedly 700 miles of range. So, they're trying to have it both ways. And, I wish we had more time, because I would love to talk, how does public transportation fit into the picture? We're not going to get to net zero and have this reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that we need if not for electrifying all of our mobility. You can't just have everyone with a personal ICE vehicle go to an EV and call it a day. We also need to rethink, what transportation looks like for us at an individual and community level. And that's a whole nother hour-long discussion. I'm gonna start wrapping up. There are some questions and comments in the chat that we didn't get to, but I will follow up with more information. Please don't forget, reach out to Michelle if you're interested in the consulting vendors grant writing bid that they're going to be having at OSD. I'll make sure that her OSD email is included in the follow-up from AEE New England. Don't forget in your giving on Giving Tuesday to consider the Green Energy Consumers Alliance and also Seawheel. I'm so grateful to you both for your time today, your expertise and knowledge. I'm grateful to folks that have participated in the chat and provided some fuel for our conversation. And I'm really hopeful that everyone came away with some really good, information, food for thought, etc. So
sorry, as I chuckled at the fuel pun.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I still laugh at what's driving the EV industry.
Yeah, I have a friend that gasses me up all the time, and I have to tell her, "Oh, you're charging me up instead." I can't use the
I'm here
lingo.
for you, boo.
Love you, girl. Awesome. Thank you all again for your time. Have a great afternoon. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.